Welcome to this month's Before You Fly, Check the Map webinar. We are having our part two of the ABCs of the National Airspace Types webinar series with our guest host, Kevin Morris, the FAA drone guy, and today we will be talking about special use airspaces. Thanks for joining me today, Kevin.
Well, thanks for having me on, Erica. I'm excited for part two here. This is going to be good stuff.
Yeah, awesome. Yes, very excited to talk about special use airspaces with you. So a little bit about your host for today's webinar. My name is Erica Cooley, and I am head of community here at Aloft. I'm a Part 107 pilot since 2017, and I'm responsible for connecting with the expanding drone community to provide educational opportunities and educational opportunities for learning about how to leverage technology of the UAS industry to fly with compliance and safety. And we are greeted, as I mentioned, by Kevin Morris. He is, as I stated, the FAA drone guy. He is an absolute subject matter expert on UAS operation and coordinates UAS communications for the Federal Aviation Administration. He previously worked in the FAA's Flight Standards Service, developing regulations, policy, and programs for drones. And he is a native Minnesotan, and he is very passionate about embracing new technology and empowering the drone community to operate safely. So thank you so much, Kevin, again, for being here. And if you'd like to share a little bit about your experience working with drone policy.
Sure. I'll just say this for working with drone policy. It's always exciting. It's one of those things where every day you wake up and something's a little bit different or something has advanced. I think the big challenge for us here at the FAA is keeping up with that pace of innovation while at the same time making sure that everybody on the ground and everybody in the air can remain safe. We definitely have one of the most complex airspace systems on the planet. And there's a lot of responsibility that goes into that with our overreaching goal is to make sure that we are able to fully integrate drones into our airspace system.
Absolutely, and we're so grateful that you're here, Kevin, to talk, and that the FAA is supporting just, so many educational opportunities to share information with the drone community, especially about the detailed nuances of the airspace and looking at maps and things like that. So moving on, we will start diving into our topic for today, which is special use airspace in the National Airspace System. So here on this slide, you'll see this is a screenshot of the Before You Fly platform on the web dashboard. As many of you know, there's also the mobile app that you can look on desktop and mobile, which is the FAA's situational awareness app that is powered by Aloft. So here is an example of a special use airspace in the national airspace, and it is colored yellow, so you'll see a yellow circle there. A lot of the airspaces we'll be looking at today do show as a yellow circle. This one is the Michigan International Speedway, so this is giving information about stadiums and other major sporting events that might be occurring, and for pilots to check for TFRs and active takeoff and landing restrictions that might prohibit them from flying in that area. So we'll also be looking at some other airspaces, and Kevin will be walking through, but that's just a introduction to what it looks like on what one of the airspaces looks like on the Before You Fly map. So now I'll hand it over to Kevin to start diving into the specific types of special use airspaces that we see in the National Airspace System.
All right, thanks, Erica. Well, who doesn't get excited for special use airspace? I know you get up in the morning, you're like, I can't wait to learn more about special use airspace. Well, good news, we're going to walk through quite a bit of it here today. So as I mentioned in my introduction, one of the goals we have in the FAA is to fully integrate drones into our national airspace system. But in doing that, we also have to make sure that we keep our level of safety or improve it that we've had over the years. So one of the things that we do is we manage our nation's airspace to make sure it stays safe for everyone. In that process of managing the airspace, there are times when there are safety or security events that require us to restrict the airspace. Now, most people think, well, you're restricting it for drones right away. Well, there the drones may be restricted, but a lot of times what we're about to talk about here today also affect traditional aircraft. So don't think this is just restrictions on drones. A lot of times it's for all aircraft types. So when we do these types of safety or security restrictions for special events, we call those temporary flight restrictions. And as the name implies, these are temporary. They are established for a certain reason and for a certain period of time, and then they'll go away. These are color coded, as you can see on the pictures on the screen there, through the Aloft app or B4UFLY as yellow. And what we're doing is talking about temporary flight restrictions that are going to prohibit operations of aircraft, which usually include drones. Remember, drones are aircraft. So some of the most common reasons you're going to see temporary flight restrictions, or TFRs, to make the abbreviation go along with the FAA's penance for abbreviating everything, is you're going to see them around major sporting events. And these are probably the most common ones you'll see around the country. For example, if you take a look on the screen there, that's the Chicago, Illinois area. You've got 3 or 4 yellow circles there on the screen, but the 3 yellow ones are around Ryan Field, Wrigley Field, Soldier Field. If there are particular events, Major League Baseball, National Football League, if there happens to be a NASCAR event, I don't think they'd be at any of those fields, but if there's an NCAA Division I game going on there, you're talking about temporary flight restrictions. So those happen anytime those types of events are going on. And the important thing is not to memorize perhaps all the reasons why a TFR might be going up, but that you check for TFRs before you fly, because not all of them are associated with sporting events. So if you look to the other side of the screen there, the other graphic, that's what we would call a VIP movement. Often people call those presidential TFRs, but it's another example of a TFR that may not be there yesterday, but all of a sudden shows up today. So these are when we have anybody that's got a VIP designation visiting the area. Again, the one that you show there in San Francisco, that was due to a presidential visit. But remember, it's really important not to memorize why TFRs go out there, but make sure you check before you fly. Because I know a few things about aviation, and I can promise you this: you don't want to be flying a drone inside a TFR, right, Erica?
Absolutely, yes. And as you mentioned, like memorizing them isn't the necessity when you have a resource that's going to be constantly updating you on, any active temporary flight restrictions. And they are, as the name states, temporary. So it's only going to impact if you're flying within that window. So checking the time frame too, right? It says the start and the end date in the airspace advisory is really effective, because you might be checking well ahead, which is a great practice for drone pilots. And that TFR might end before your operations are going to start, or if you're starting, checking right at the time you'd like to fly, it might impact your operation. So it's always great to be on that as far ahead of time as possible, or check in the moment. And moving on to our next type, so definitely some great information there about stadiums and VIP movement, TFRs. Another type of special use airspace that you might see color coded as yellow on the B4UFLY map is a local layer. So we at Aloft had a partnership with the city of San Francisco to actually add in all of their takeoff and landing restriction information to the B4UFLY platform. So all the parks in the city of San Francisco do have takeoff and landing restrictions. So here in this graphic, you'll see a screenshot from B4UFLY of Lake Merced Park in San Francisco. And this is actually an area where you're not allowed to fly a drone. Not necessarily the airspace is restricted from the FAA, but it's actually ground rules. So this could be similarly correlated to the national parks rule, that you are not allowed to take off and land your drone from national park land, same as this would apply to a local park there in San Francisco. And there are some other parks around the country. A little note for anyone who's listening that might be a part of a local government system or an authoritative resource, we do have the Geo portal, which is a great resource for if there are any local rules that you'd like added to the B4UFLY map that have to do with ground rules, that's a great resource to add those in, and it's a free tool. I'll link that in the chat for the webinar platform. But yeah, so local layers are something that you might see, and that's another, you'll get that caution message, and really just reading the details there. You'll see in this one for regional parks in San Francisco, they have rules against operating drones in their local parks, as I mentioned. We'll move our next space, and I'll hand SFRAs over to Kevin to give you a little more information about those.
All right, so we talked a little bit about some of the local rules that you just covered there, Erica, and then previous to that, I talked about what temporary flight restrictions are. Let's get into maybe some that are a little bit more permanent. A lot of times we call those special flight rules area SFRAs, or as a lot of people say, SFRA, in which I'm going to say because SFRA seems very disjointed for me to say here in the next couple minutes as I go through this. So obviously there are certain areas of this country that have ongoing flight restrictions. These are flight restrictions that are going to exist all the time. They're not temporary in nature. Probably the easiest one to point at is the National Capital Region. This is governed by a SFRA. It's a 30-mile radius around the Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. It's got a lot of restrictions built into it, as you could probably imagine. So we're going to talk about this one just because it's probably the biggest, maybe arguably the most important, and it's not complex, but there's a couple different layers to it. So it's really divided into a couple segments. You have a 15-mile radius inner ring, and then you have this 30-mile radius outer ring. So the easy thing to remember is just check the app before you go fly. If you want to make sure you can fly in a particular area, look at the app. Again, memorizing this stuff is not important, but we wanted to provide you a little bit of background why this stuff exists. So if you happen to be within the inner, that 15-mile radius inner ring of the SFRA, drone flying is prohibited. You're getting really into the Capitol Mall area. All the important buildings in the Washington, D.C. area are going to be within there. And so drone flying is prohibited. Now, that doesn't mean you can't get access to it if you have a really good purpose to have access to it. Part 107 of public aircraft operators, there's a process that you can go through to obtain necessary waivers and authorizations from not only the FAA, but also the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA. They are going to be involved in it because of the restricted airspace. But if you wanted to go fly your drone because you wanted to take pictures of the Washington Monument, safe bet that you're not going to get authorization to fly within that inner mile. Now, that outer ring does allow a little bit of drone flying, but because it's a special flight rules area, the SFRA requires a few different things if you're going to fly a drone out there. One, that it has to weigh less than 55 pounds. That includes anything attached to the drone. You're going to be flying at or below 400 feet. And why I say or below is because there may be some particular areas that have airports with controlled airspace that are going to have lower altitudes on UAS facility maps. You'll need to use LANCs to get those authorizations, but you may be restricted to lower than 400 feet depending on where you're going to fly. And you always need to keep your drone within visual line of sight. That's kind of a good rule just to keep in mind at all times. So Washington airspace is probably the most complex. You can look on the map there. You can see there's quite a big area. But this is our national defense airspace. Really, it's not, as I mentioned before, these aren't all just for drones. This really applies to all aircraft. All aircraft operating in and out of that particular area are subject to the rules of that special flight rules area. So it's important to remember that check your Aloft or before you fly or your Lance UAS service supplier to see if there's any sort of airspace restrictions and follow those restrictions, because you don't want to be on the other end where somebody comes up to you and says, hey, you're flying a drone in an area that's prohibited because of the special flight rules area, and they mention national defense airspace. That's not a good day for anyone. So always check your app before you fly. And I think we have another example too coming up here, right, Eric, of another SFRA?
Yes, I'll move on to that one. Yeah, there you go.
All right, here we go. So this is another example. This is in the New York area. We're talking specifically about the Hudson and East River. And I was actually just on the East River. I took a ferry across that. We did a little promo shoot about the Special Flight Reserve not too long ago. So make sure you follow the FAA Drone Zone account on Twitter. You can see me riding a ferry and trying to do a video. It's a good time. But this is another example here of a SFRA. The reason this particular one exists is because there is a tremendous amount of low-flying helicopters that maneuver up and down both the Hudson and the East River. So just like Washington, D.C., this is going to be a no-drone zone, although it's not as large and circular in shape. You can see on the screenshot there, the area over the Hudson and East River are shaded red, and those are because they're a permanent flight restriction. So this SFRA is permanent under Part 93, which is our rules for special air traffic procedures. So these are just a couple examples of special flight rules areas or SFRAs in our national airspace system. Again, I think Erica will probably say this a few other times, but always go back and just check your preferred app, whether that be B4UFLY or another app. Just make sure that you're looking at airspace prior to takeoff. You want to be aware if there's any advisories in the area, like Erica, like you were pointing out, to make sure there's no temporary flight restrictions that'll be active in your area, and also make sure that you don't need a LANCE airspace authorization from the FAA before you go fly.
Absolutely. I wanted to jump back just to the slide for the Washington, D.C. area to kind of highlight this graphic. To clarify, we had a question that came up. This circle that's yellow is that 30-mile radius, correct? And this inner ring where it's kind of orange overlay would be that 15-mile restricted area. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep. So
Okay.
it's a pretty good representation there of sort of, I wouldn't, it's more of a cautionary. Remember that 15 to 30-mile range, you can fly drones. There's just a few things you have to make sure you're doing. And then, of course, that inner area is red, much like the Hudson, where you're just not going to be flying drones unless you go through a lot of red tape to operate your drone there.
Absolutely. Thanks for clarifying that, because sometimes when we get multiple layers of colors, can be a little bit more tricky to see those, but I wanted to highlight the area there in the center is that 15-mile radius that Kevin was referencing. Move back. Okay, and I think our last special use airspace would be MOAs.
Yes, MOA, the military operations area. You'll find these pretty much all over the place, and they have various shapes and sizes, and they're really dependent upon what the U.S. military needs in that particular area. So the purpose of a military operations area, which are color-coded yellow through the app there that you can see on the screen, are really to separate military traffic from all other traffic. If you look at the Shoshone military operations area on the screen, it's in yellow there. That particular MOA, as well as all MOAs, are going to have a few components to it. They're going to have an altitude component, and they'll also have a time of day and also a day of week component to it as well. So they're not 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A lot of them are active only during a particular time. So the Shoshone MOA that you see on the screen there is active between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Monday through Friday. So they're not doing work on the weekends in there, but they might have to, and if they do, they'll publish a NOTAM to cover that. This one isn't a prohibited area. This isn't an airspace that you're not allowed to fly a drone in, but we note these on sectional charts. We put them on our LANCE and USS service suppliers here just because we want you to be aware that there are potential for military aircraft operating in the particular area at particular altitudes. A lot of them start much higher than drones are probably going to end up flying, but some of them start pretty low. And you really wouldn't want to be flying your drone and have a military helicopter or other aircraft come up on you pretty quickly and have to take evasive action. That's something we're trying to avoid. So really, if you find yourself standing somewhere where there's a military operations area, just maybe have maybe an extra visual observer along with you, or take a couple other precautions to reduce the risk of any unintended conflict of aircraft operating in the area. So again, going to go back to my blanket statement here. Always check the app. Always take a look at the airspace that you're flying in. And if you're in an area where there's a potential to maybe interact with high-speed moving aircraft, maybe bring a few other people along to help you watch that airspace.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is always a great tool to have visual observers where, where there might be extra caution that needs to be taken. So that is a really great point. And also pointing out again the effective times and dates for these in those airspace advisories really helps the drone pilot be as educated as possible for their operations in that area. Well, excellent. Well, we have gotten lots of questions in the chat. So if those are our airspaces that we wanted to talk about in the presentation, so we're really excited to open it up for our live Q&A, and we can even open up before you fly and do some demos showing the different airspace types if people would like to talk about them.
All right, sounds good.
Alrighty, so Kevin and I are coming on live now for the live Q&A portion of our webinar. Thank you everyone for being so engaged in the chat. We also fielded some questions from the audience beforehand, so thank you for everyone who sent those, and thank you, Kevin, for being here today live with us.
Yep, super excited to get some questions answered. This is one of my favorite parts, and I think that video was so long I had time to get my hair cut in between the start and the end. So happy to be here.
Yes, absolutely. There is a lot of special use airspaces as the audience of our presentation. So for the first question, we received a question from Paul Johansson, and this one I'll shoot over to Kevin. His question was on if there are any new night flight rules.
Great question. I don't think I'm going to be allowed to call them new anymore, as they've been out for a little while. But really what we're talking about is two different types of flying. So that's something that most, if not all, drone operators are going to have to recognize before they go fly, is sort of which bucket are you flying your drone out of? Is it going to be the Part 107 bucket, which covers pretty much all civil drone regulations, or are you going to be flying under Section 44809, which is strictly recreational flyer? Not that the rules are going to change significantly between the two. Most of them are pretty similar, but about must be a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago now, we updated the rules for operating at night. Whereas prior to that rule change, you had to go apply to the FAA, you had to go get a waiver, you had to take all these steps and risk mitigation, and it was a lot of work. And what we saw was that our number one requested waiver was for night. Thousands of them, if you can imagine that. That's a lot of work. But we were able to take that data and lessons learned and change that into a rule update. And that rule update now permits flying at night under Part 107, as long as you've taken either an initial test or recurrent test. I'm going to get the date wrong, but it's somewhere around April of last year, I think, if my memory serves me correct. But the good news with that recurrent test is we made it online, free. Just go to FAAsafety.gov and you can take a Part 107 recurrent test if you hold a Part 107 remote pilot certificate. Then you can fly at night according to the rule. You can read the rules. There's lighting requirements and things like that, but it is a permissive rule. So you can fly at night without a waiver under Part 107. On the recreational flyer side, that falls under Section 44809, which gets a little bit more complex just because it brings in this term called community-based organizations and safety guidelines. But in the end, you'll end up following pretty much the same rules. You're going to want to have your drone somehow illuminated, not just so that you can see it, but that if there's any other aircraft operating, they can see it as well. So if you're interested in night flying, you can go to our website at fa.gov/UAS, and we have all that information on there, so you didn't have to quickly take notes while I talked.
Awesome. And I also just popped in the chat that we at Aloft released a blog and a tutorial video that goes through everything that Kevin was mentioning about the recurrent test and some of the information that's pertinent for flying at night. Awesome. So we received another question from Jerry Lutkin, and this question I will see if I can address. The question is, while operating in uncontrolled airspace, I have small single engine airplanes along with helicopters not showing up on Aloft or the B4UFLY platform. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, I would assume that means seeing other aircraft in the airspace that are potentially helicopters or single engine aircrafts. And so those on the B4UFLY platform and Aloft platforms, it is mainly speaking to drone operations. So if you're seeing any notify and flies that are showing drone operations, that would be other drone pilots who are indicating that they're operating in that area. Manned or crewed aircrafts are not most likely engaging on those platforms. They, could be viewing them, for information, but very likely they wouldn't be announcing their presence on these platforms that they're operating in the area. So, just remembering some of the basics of, if you're Part 107 from the test of always yielding right of way to those larger aircraft. You will notice on the Before You Fly or Aloft map that there are icons for municipal airports and things like that are in uncontrolled airspace. So you'll see those as little red icons, and I'll put in the chat a blog and video that we made about airspace or municipal airports, uncontrolled airspace airports that you are allowed to fly in without a LANC authorization, but those are some of the things that you might on the platform pertaining to other types of aircraft. So another question that we received from Milton Clary, and I'll share this one over with Kevin, is I live in Fairfax, Virginia, which is within the flight restricted zone for the National Capital Region. What are steps that I can take to fly in the FREZA? So you did touch on this a little bit in your presentation, but if you'd like to speak more to that, Kevin?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Milton, for that question. And you live kind of right in the heart of our national defense airspace, and probably, as I mentioned in the webinar, one of the most complex, security-driven, and critical segments of airspace we have in this country. So you're in an area that's just generally tough to fly in, and I'll mention this again, not just for drone pilots. In order for any aircraft to fly in and out of that, the flight restricted zone or the special flight rules area, there are additional requirements for that particular area. Aircraft arriving in and out of Reagan National Airport, they have different requirements as well. But let's just get back to drones here. Couple things. If you're in the flight restricted zone, that inner mile, that 15-mile radius, you're probably not going to be flying your drone. I'm sorry to say. There's just, while I did mention there are avenues for legitimate purposes for drone operations to get authorization to fly in that particular area, those will not be given to recreational flyers. So again, if you wanted to take a photo of the Lincoln Memorial, not happening. But there are ways for public safety and other experienced Part 107 operators to get permission to fly within that area. So if you're within that flight restricted zone, that 15-mile radius, that inner ring, you're not going to be flying for any recreational purposes. If you do need to fly, you better have a really good reason, and you're going to have to go through a few different phone calls and emails to get your clearance and authorization to fly, and I can almost guarantee it'll be very closely watched at all times. But if you can move outside of that 15-mile radius and get into the special flight rules area, it doesn't necessarily open it up like if you were flying in the middle of the country somewhere perhaps, but you are able to fly, recreational flyers included. That's when it gets to the aircraft maximum weight. It has to weigh under 55 pounds. The aircraft has to be registered, marked, stay below 400 feet. We have on our website the NOTAM, which is just a whole bunch of text in all caps. I know it's very difficult to read, but we have it plain language on our website. Again, I'll put our website out there as faa.gov/UAS. You can get to that plain language and see just very clearly what the requirements are before you were to go fly in the special flight rules area. But like I mentioned earlier, like Erica has mentioned, always check the app. Just make sure you're not about to take off in airspace that's restricted or has additional requirements like the SFRA will, or perhaps you're flying in controlled airspace where you need an FAA airspace authorization.
Absolutely. And, speaking as you did to that being one of the most complicated airspaces in the country, really checking that each time to see if there are any different notifications that would pertain. So now we have a question from Eric Larson, and I'll share this one with Kevin as well. Are there areas in which hobbyist pilots with no commercial license are prohibited from requesting permission to fly?
Yes, there are. We touched on quite a few of them here in this webinar. Mainly prohibited airspace, restricted airspace, Some special flight rules areas are going to be areas where recreational flying is not going to be prohibited. You'll also notice a difference when we get into airspace authorizations. I think, Erica, you even mentioned it a little bit earlier. You mentioned further coordination. That's kind of a fancy way for us to say you're requesting to fly above an altitude in a UAS facility map. For recreational flyers, that's not going to happen without an additional sort of communication stream, meaning we are working individually through risk management assessment panels with different organizations to try to help them have access to fly a little bit higher. But your typical recreational flyer that says, well, I can only fly up to 50 feet here, says the UAS facility map, but I want to go up to 200 feet, you're not going to get that approval to fly. So really, we're talking prohibited airspace, restricted airspace, some special flight rules area. Those are going to be temporary flight restrictions. I would include there as well. Those are going to be the areas where recreational flying is more than likely flat out prohibited. There are some other instances where recreational flying doesn't have as much access as Part 107. You can look at, I just mentioned there with the airspace altitudes, but those areas that you're a safe bet that recreational flying wouldn't be permitted to fly.
Absolutely. And I think this is kind of a nice segue into looking at the map. If you guys would like to, I'm going to share my screen. So we received a question from Patrick Hill that was actually asking to look at the different airspaces that surround the Seattle area, which was close to my heart. That is where I'm located. So there are 3 different controlled airspaces in the Seattle Tacoma area, and they all overlap. So there's the Renton Airport, and then there's Boeing Field, and then there's SeaTac International Airport. And so I'm going to share my screen, and I think it would be interesting for us to look at those and kind of go over how you can really look at the different grids to understand, the ceilings, and as Kevin was mentioning, those potential for further coordination that you would need to. So I'm going to pull up. All right. Can you guys see my screen? Can you see the map?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay, awesome. So right here, I have actually pulled up, I'm on the air control platform. We recently released that, so anyone can use that platform. If you're a single individual pilot, you can use it for free, just as the same as you did using the Aloft Classic app. But here we're able to see this Seattle area, and you'll see that there are multiple circles, and in each of those circles there are different red blocks that represent the actual runway, the field of these controlled airspaces. So when we're down here, and if we drop our pin, so these grids represent the ceiling height. So this all comes from the FAA's UAS facility map information. And if we dropped our pin here in this 50-foot block, you'll see that on the right-hand panel, we are seeing the SeaTac airport, the Class B airspace, and it is controlled airspace and low altitude only authorization, so LANC authorizations, and is effective 24 hours a day. And when we're looking over here, you'll see these different blocks. So wherever you drop your pin and that number that corresponds to that space is going to be the max ceiling height. So something interesting in this area that I think the question from Patrick was asking is there's a lot of overlap, right? These airspaces kind of overlap with each other. And so if you are desiring to fly in one of these areas where it overlaps, you just would be constrained for auto approval by whatever the ceiling height is for that grid. And so the best way to test this out is just to use either your preferred UAS service supplier or use the air control platform. And you can kind of research this ahead of time by moving your pin around. You can also, up here in the top right corner, you can search an exact address, and so that will give you that opportunity to see exactly what the grid is. But so what's something that's interesting also in the Renton area, so we looked over here at the SeaTac airport, but if we come over here to the Class D airspace surrounding RNT's airport, and we drop down on this right-hand side, we'll see actually that there are times. There are scheduled times. So this airport, if you're operating within these scheduled windows, so you'll see there's a date range, but there's also a time of day that that you would need to apply for a LANC authorization specifically to fly in this area. So that's another good one to recognize. Like a lot of these are mostly daytime hours, and so if you're flying really late at night, it might not impact you to need to apply for a LANC authorization. If we come up here into Boeing Field, so right now we have kind of an interesting airspace phenomenon that's going on here. We actually have a presidential TFR. So this is very, very neat that Patrick brought this up, because we're able to show many different layers of airspace airspace information that you can see here. And really recognizing, yes, when you have a high density of information you're looking at the map, all those layers can it can get a little bit overwhelming, but really understanding what the colors indicate and some of the information that Kevin and I shared today, we hope helps make this more accessible for you. But if there wasn't, or after this presidential TFR ends, which ends in about 3 hours here in local time in Pacific, this would be Class D airspace surrounding BFI, Boeing Field, and you would be able to apply for a LANC authorization up to the maximum ceiling height. So you can apply for a LANC authorization on the web and on mobile. I have some tutorial videos that I can link to show you that entire process of how you would do that. But I hope that, looking at this airspace that really has some density and overlap was helpful. Yeah, was there anything that you'd like to add, Kevin, for that?
I'd say maybe today's not the day to fly around the Seattle area.
Yes, lot going on there. Awesome.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job explaining that, Erica. I would just add that you don't have to necessarily worry which facility is controlling that airspace. With B4UFLY, with our LANC UAS service suppliers, when you submit that LANC authorization request, it will be routed to the appropriate air traffic facility system for authorization. So it's not something where you're trying to figure out, boy, does this really need to go to, let's say, Renton, or does it have to go to SeaTac or something like that? You can just really submit your LANC authorization and it'll take care of it for you. I think from an operational standpoint, other than noting that there's a presidential TFR happening here, I think most of drone operators are concerned with the altitude limits. How high can I fly my drone? You need to do a roof inspection, building tower inspection. That's really the information you're looking for. That's all provided here. And as Erica pointed out, even if there's multi-layers going on, you drop the pin, you type in an address, it's going to tell you everything happening at that spot. And as a good drone pilot, you really should read through all that prior to flight.
Absolutely. And, bringing up, I think it's great that you bring up air traffic control as, the deeming body that's getting this information, because that's who this, a drone operation would impact, or a drone operation would impact. And so if you are in this 0-foot grid, and we'll have some, opportunity at a different time, maybe to go into this deeper in another webinar, but if you do apply for a further coordination response, that's going directly to the air traffic control organization for that airport, and they're, looking through your safety statement and all of your information that you've provided of how you're going to safely operate your drone within that 0-foot grid. And you can see a lot of these areas that have 0-foot ceilings, they're closest to the field, right? They're closest to the actual area where airplanes are taking off and landing, and so therefore flying at low altitudes. So yeah, I'm glad we got to dive into that. I think there's lots of questions around that. And again, maybe even having, a future webinar that goes into further coordination responses or requests would be of interest. But for interest of everyone's time, Going to plug through a few more questions we got. Thank you so much, everyone, for your engagement. Another question that we received from Adam Hunter, I'll take this one, is about geofencing and drones. The question is, are there any general information about brands of drones that adopt this technology? So great question, Adam. I would say it's one that we receive a lot here at Aloft. I'll speak specifically to DJI's geofencing. That's one that we get the most questions about currently. And yes, there is a system that DJI has in place that I wouldn't say necessarily reflects the FAA's UAS facility maps. So it's really important that if you see, some sort of geofence lock on your device that's saying that you can't fly in that area, check the before you fly map, cross-reference that. You may indeed need to fly or receive a LANC authorization to fly in that area, but it also may not be accurate. The FAA is, the authoritative body on all of airspace regulations. So using the before you fly, map to reference is the best, but I'm going to put a link in the chat for you to just dive deeper. If your question, Adam, was about DJI, there's a whole process that you can use through a DJI to unlock an area that if you received a LANC authorization and you're approved, then you are allowed to fly in that area. Or, if it is an error on the DJI's system side and it's not in controlled airspace, you also would want to unlock that so that you can operate there. I had some operations for a few years that I did that were in that in a locked zone that was not controlled airspace. And just from my personal experience, as far in advance as you can unlock your drone, try not to do it out in the field. It's not as quick and easy as the LANC system is. We'll say that, right? As the auto approval is. So put that in the chat. And let's see, I'll hopefully have time for just a few more questions. I'll send this one over to Kevin. This one is from Alan Blakeney, and I've had several requests to fly the perimeter of an NCAA stadium on game day. What is the rule? Great question there, yeah.
All right, yeah, that's a really good question. It's going to be, let's see if I can answer it here in as plain language as I can. First of all, I'm going to make an assumption that you're flying under Part 107, because as we talked about in our webinar here, if you're flying recreationally, and a lot of people call it a stadium TFR, is in effect, that's that 3-mile radius around stadiums on game days, you're not going to get authorization to fly recreationally, in that TFR. That being said, there are a lot of Part 107 operators that do get authorization to fly in that TFR. So first of all, what are we really talking about here? Well, we're talking about a temporary flight restriction. This is carried by a notice to air mission that the FAA sort of has standing. It's just a standing stadium TFR, if you will. And it affects those stadiums that have 30,000 seating capacity or greater and are hosting Major League Baseball, National Football League, NCAA Division I football games, and NASCAR, IndyCar, and Champ Car Series. I think I got all those right. But those are the events. Now, what's really important to mention as well is that these are regular or postseason games. We've had some amazing drone footage taken from actually one of our drone pros in the Denver area of the Denver Broncos Stadium during preseason. And everybody always gets excited. Well, you're flying in the TFR? Well, no, that's a preseason game. So keep in mind, you need to understand the TFR before you go fly, because there are those little nuances to it. Now, so how do you get permission to fly within the TFR? If you look at the actual TFR, which I believe the Before You Fly app will direct you to if you want to take a look at that, there's going to be contact information included in that TFR. Now, the stadium TFR, again, it's in all caps. There's no paragraphs to it, and it's about 3 scrolls long. But I'm going to give you the shortcut. Go straight to the bottom. There you're going to see the controlling agency for any TFR that's in effect. If you read that NOTAM, you'll see a controlling agency. You'll see either an email or a telephone number. That's where you start. That's going to be your first call to say, hey, this is what I need to do. I've been requested to do this. How can I make it work? And you begin that conversation. It's not necessarily going to be easy. These flight restrictions are in effect for specific reasons. In these cases here, we're talking about stadium and attendance and people's security. So there's reasons for them, but that doesn't mean it's just an automatic no either. There are some legitimate reasons for doing work in there. So I think it was Alan asked me that question. Alan, go to the NOTAM, the Notice to Air Mission, go to the bottom, start with that phone number, and then that'll begin the process. And as Erica just pointed out, even with unlocking something like a DJI geofence, start the process early. Don't wait until the day before you need to shoot to call that number. Start early.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, just a good rule of thumb with, anything I think in aviation, but also in the, pertaining to drones specifically is, yes, starting early is always great. We've had lots of questions in the chat. One that I wanted to touch on, and hopefully, Kevin can kind of fill in any holes that I have, is about, we referenced a few times, airports or controlled airspace that have towers that close. So that really, kind of honing in on that, that means that during that window of time that's specified in the airspace advisory is when that is controlled airspace. And after the time has closed, that tower has closed, so there's no longer air traffic control. And so, please correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, that would be deemed as uncontrolled airspace, and you would be able to fly up to 400 feet without a LANC authorization.
Well, now let me put on my flight standard safety hat and make a course correction here. Eric, I'm really sorry to do this to you.
Yeah, no.
So first of all, this is a great question. I know that I say that a lot. This is truly a great question, because what happens when a part-time tower, and many of our air traffic control facilities at smaller airports are part-time, what happens when that tower closes? The pilot answer, going back to my traditional aircraft piloting days, the pilot answer is to look at the FAA's chart supplement. It used to be called the Airport Facility Directory. I'm really old. They've changed the name. I believe it's now called the FAA, the chart supplement. My oldest son would correct me on that. He's in pilot training at one of our universities there. He probably knows the answer. That will tell you exactly what happens to that airspace when the tower closes. More often than not, when a tower closes, that controlled airspace, whether it's class Charlie or class Delta, typically speaking, class Bravo towers don't close. The big airports, they stay open 24 hours a day. Typically, that airspace will revert to class Echo. It'll be class E. So it remains controlled airspace, but it doesn't have an operating control tower. From a drone pilot's perspective, it doesn't really change what you do. So if you were to go fly there and you were to check the app, I'm pretty sure any of the LANC US service suppliers will tell you, hey, this is class Echo or class Delta maybe, but it will tell you need an airspace authorization, and that's most likely correct. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any. Now, I'm sure there is somebody out there internet sleuthing right now. I can't think of any control towers that close where that airspace then reverts to class Gulf or class G airspace. I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think they all revert to class E Echo. Typically speaking, if there's a control tower there during the day, it's a busier airport. It's more than likely got instrument approaches to the runway. So when the tower closes at 10 p.m. or midnight, they want to still be able to protect that airspace. Remember, controlled airspace doesn't mean that air traffic control is controlling everything in that airspace. It means that they have the responsibility to ensure that aircraft separation that they are controlling happens. So it's sort of a tough term to understand, but yeah, it's very easy to think, well, if the tower's closed, air traffic's not controlling it, it's uncontrolled airspace, but it's probably not. So again, always check that before you fly up. Almost certain it reverts to class Echo everywhere, but I'm sure somebody will point out the one instance where I'm wrong, and that's okay.
Yeah, and class Echo is the kind of airspace that can sometimes be a little bit tricky because of the ceiling height, correct? That where class Echo airspace starts and how it impacts drones.
Yeah, it's when I mention class Echo, now we're going to get into kind of the nerd level of airspace. So bear with me if you're still watching here. There's a lot of different subsets of class Echo airspace, and in terms of a drone pilot, you're really only concerned with what we call surface class E designated for an airport, which the FAA terms Echo 2 airspace. So you don't really necessarily have to worry about class E starting above you. Most of the country class E starts at either 700 feet above ground or 1,200 feet above ground. What we're talking about here is when class E goes right down to the surface. And that's when you see hey, I need a Lance authorization to fly next to this airport, but there's no control tower even there. Why do I need that? That's because Class E goes to the surface. That controlled airspace, that Class E, right down to the ground. That's why you're going to need that authorization there. So there are a lot of different nuances, and we could do a whole webinar, and I've done webinars on Class E airspace because it's a little bit goofy. But if you can just remember from a drone pilot perspective, just before you lift off the ground, pull out that app, give it a check. It's going to tell you what's right and wrong and what you need to do, and you're going to be 10 steps ahead of anybody that doesn't check the app.
Awesome. Thank you so much, yeah, for going into those details. I think, even for, people who have been flying for a long time, there are certain airspaces that are nice to review and, go over. So that's great. I think we have time for one final question. I really appreciate everyone's engagement, and any that we didn't have a chance to answer, we'll hopefully be able to pull those out of the chat and maybe, direct our answers back directly to you after the webinar. But I'll give one last question to Kevin. We received this from Eric Ruse, and it is, if one receives FAA clearance to fly bearing any pre-designated authorized locations, can a city or county require one to obtain a permit before flying?
Yeah, I'm going to answer this one very, very, very carefully because I like my job. So the FAA manages the airspace. Our job is to ensure the airspace remains the safest in the world, the most efficient in the world, and that's what we strive to do every single day. But we're not the only players, if you will, in this field of aviation. So states, cities, they also have their own requirements. And I'm not going to talk about the airspace piece because I know I'm not even going to go down that rabbit hole about cities doing things with airspace, but they can certainly regulate what you do within their city limits standing on their property. And that includes requiring you to perhaps pay a registration fee. If you look at if you were to buy an airplane, you were in a traditional airplane, you were keep it at your airport, more than likely you're going to have to pay a license fee for that, just like you would for a boat. I'm trying not to sound too Minnesotan here, but for a boat or a snowmobile, you're going to have to put a registration sticker on that, just like you would your car. The state has the authority to register or require registration as well. So it's always good to check with your local regulations. And Eric, I know you touched on some of the work that Aloft has done with San Francisco to sort of incorporate some of their ordinances into the app. I'm assuming you don't have that all across the entire country. So it's a good rule that if you're going to fly somewhere at a park, make sure that the city doesn't have an ordinance that says you can't take off or land a drone here. I think, Erica, you mentioned our national park system. The national park system doesn't say you can't fly a drone above a national park, but what they will say is you can't take off or land within the national park's boundaries, and they're completely within their right to do that. So when it comes to additional registration, I know I live in Minnesota. I believe the state of Minnesota still requires commercial drones be carrying commercial licenses, aircraft licenses from the state of Minnesota, and they're well within their statutory authority to require those types of licenses or registration requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you're traveling to different areas that you haven't flown before, it's always great to, plan ahead, looking at, any of those different, local regulations that might impact, not just the airspace, but the ground. We have to take off from somewhere with our drones. So it's important, yeah, looking on that. And yes, you're correct, Kevin. It doesn't currently, the local layers are exclusive. They're not all parks, but that is, the system of GEO, hoping that, authoritative agencies will be able to ingest more information, just continuing to add even more ground rules and information like that, so that drone pilots can have as much information as desired. So with that, we're getting really close with time. I really appreciate Kevin being here. Like I've said in our past webinar, every time I get to talk with you, I learn so much as a drone pilot, and I so appreciate you lending your expertise and time for our community. It really makes a difference to have, somebody who can give those direct answers to questions. So appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. It's always a pleasure to be on, and this is one of those things where we're all in this together. Whether you're sitting wearing an FAA shirt, or you're working for one of our service suppliers like Erica, or you're just flying a drone out there for fun or commercial purposes, this is all something we have to do together and work towards solutions that work for everyone. And before I go, let me get my shameless plug in here. Please visit our website for all the latest information. We just announced a few important things on Mondays for recreational flyers and regarding remote ID and remote ID free zones called FRIAs. So you want to take a look at that. If you're trying to keep up with pace and everything that's happening at the FAA, the very best way to do that is to make sure you follow us on social media. We have 2 accounts dedicated purely for drone flying, and they're both our FAA Drone Zone accounts on Twitter and on Facebook. And if you can't find the information there, you can always send us an email at uashelp@faa.gov or check out our website, faa.gov/UAS.
Awesome. And I put in the chat there the link to the FAA's website. Yes, absolutely. A great opportunity to get some information directly from the FAA. And with that, I will close out our webinar today. Thank you everyone who joined. Wonderful engagement as always. Any questions that we didn't get to address today, I'll pull those out of the chat and see if we can reach out to you directly to get any answers back to you. And thanks again, Kevin. Really appreciate it. You all have a wonderful day.
Take care. Bye-bye.